The talk was also with Ginny. I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll have Ginny. I am the historical architect for SHPO, so I review. I administer the historic tax credit program, but I also do architectural reviews for our Section 106 program and our some of the grants and other things that the CLG grants and those sorts of things. 138 reviews. I originally practiced as an architect. I'm a licensed architect, and then moved to the owner's side and worked at the Minnesota Historical Society, managing preservation projects there. And then eventually moved to the SHPO, where I review projects there now. And here is Ginny.
Hi, I'm Ginny Way. I'm the National Register Architectural Historian for the State Historic Preservation Office within the Department of Administration. And I just really like to say that all because it makes me sound important. So I coordinate the National Register program, and I do everything else that has to do with eligibility. So I do 106 reviews, I do tax credit projects, I do contexts, grants, anything that has anything to do with the analysis of eligibility. So in this room, under most circumstances, you might see my name on your Part 1 application. You're never going to see my name on your environmental review request for additional documentation or information, but it comes from me.
Asking for things.
You know who the boss is.
Well, I ain't the boss of nobody, that's for sure. Except for maybe my kitties. I should tell you that I have 2 kitties, Jet and Tuppence. They almost got included in the presentation, but I decided maybe not. Leslie encouraged me to include them. So we should get to content. Okay, and just obviously it is, and here I don't want to scare you all, but it is the morning, but this is confusing. So this is, what we're here to mostly talk about is a lot of confusion, and I could hear some throughout this conference about the standards, and people use the standards to mean bunches of different things. So we're not talking about the MnDOT standards for crash rails. We're not talking about what people often get the standards, the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic buildings, confused with the criterion for the National Register and the 7 aspects of integrity. And we're going to try and cover that full width and make sure everybody has a good understanding of how we go through them and use them and how they interlock and don't interlock or aren't used together, mixed together. So with that, I consider as an architect who applies the standards on a regular basis as the criterion and the 7 aspects of integrity is the basis for using the standards. So they are not mixed. So we're gonna start with Ginny talking about those things so that we then have a context of how to apply the standards. So here you go.
Okay, so just to start, in case none of you are familiar, or all of you aren't familiar, the National Register of Historic Places defines itself as the official list of sites, buildings, structures, objects significant to American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. It consists of 5 different property types. So historic districts, structures, which are things not built for humans, sites, which are landscapes, archaeological sites, things that tend to be the land as opposed to what we would call improvements on the land, buildings, and objects. Objects being Paul and Babe over there, right? So the difference between a building and a structure is a building is meant for human habitation and a structure is not. Under most circumstances, when we're talking about the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, which is what we're focused on here, we're going to be talking about buildings because that is most often what we see. Understand that all of the National Register guidelines apply to all of these types of properties. And all the things that you can think of that we can put into one of those 5 buckets. So when we assess the eligibility of a property, we think about 3 things specifically. We think about historic significance, period of significance, and historic integrity. And I've written them down in the order we think about them, but I want you to think about them as foundational pieces, right? So you cannot know the period of significance until you know the historic significance. And you cannot know whether or not the building has integrity, or the property has integrity, until you know the period of significance. We've heard a lot yesterday, and I completely support this idea, that there are lots of ways to interpret integrity, there are lots of ways to interpret importance and significance. What we're talking about here today is a very practical application of this program for the purposes of rehabilitation. If you want to talk about how we apply integrity to traditional cultural places, let's do that, but not here. Let's do that in the hall, or you can call me and we can talk about it for an extended period of time, because I nerd out about this stuff like a ton. But we're gonna stay very focused in this conversation because it can get real big real fast. Okay, in order to be eligible, you have to be significant under one of 4 criteria. They are cleverly named A, B, C, and D. So criterion A is history, basically, you associated with an event that's made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of history. This is basically all the things. Criterion B is associated with a person significant to our past. Criterion C is distinctive characteristics. So this is typically what we see, architecture, engineering. And then D is yielded or likely to yield information important in history and prehistory. And just to put it out there for archaeology, I have to say it every time I talk about the criteria, or David Mather, or National Register archaeologist, will smite me. All the properties can be eligible under any of the criteria, regardless of the type. So I'm going to focus on 2 today, again, going back to that practical reality of what we're talking about. Buildings and structures are most likely to be eligible under the first criterion, criterion A. So what we're seeing here is the Minnesota Mutual Life Insurance building that is in downtown St. Paul, significant for its association with an insurance company that was women-owned. Moorhead Storage Transfer Company up in the Red River Valley in Moorhead, this was significant for association with industry, particularly the potato industry. And then the Bjorker building in Northfield, that building is part of a historic district that is significant for its association with the development of Northfield. So we have 2 individually listed buildings. You can see they are very different architectural styles. They were built during different times. And then we have the Bjorker building, which is a Main Street building, very different in scale and size and style to the other 2. So under criterion C, a property that embodies distinctive characteristics of the type, period, or method of construction. Here we happen to have 3 instances of an architecture argument. So the Ely State Theater, a Deco Theater, the First National Bank of Mankato, prior to the addition that we're sitting in now, that was individually eligible for prairie style architecture, and then the coal block, which is in the Owatonna Commercial Historic District. That district is eligible under both A and C, but in this case we're using it as an illustration of the architectural style, which is the tie knit in this case. So as you're approaching your building, it will be eligible for one of the 4 criteria, most typically these 3 things. So once we know why a property is eligible, whether it's associated with a history or whether or not it is in fact eligible for its architectural style within the context, we have to define the period of significance. So this is the length of time a property was associated with the important events. So when we're thinking about how a criteria relates to a period of time, we have to think about how long that association existed. So under criterion C for architecture, a period of significance is typically a single year. It was the year the building was built. If there are also significant additions, then we'll consider that. But so you have 1 year, right? So this is typically what we think about when we think about historic preservation in a public history sense. When we think about, we're going to take our building back to 1880 when it was built, right? This is more along those lines, that your period of significance is a single year. Under criterion A, where that association is longer, your period of significance can be many, many years. And in case of some of our commercial historic districts in the state of Minnesota, the period of significance is 100 years. Your downtown commercial historic district was associated with commerce and was the most significant place for commerce in your local community from 1890 to 1990, right? So your periods of significance change vastly depending on what the significance of your property is. Now, once you know why your building is significant and when it was significant, then you can assess integrity. The 7 aspects of integrity are listed here: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. They are not listed in any particular order. Depending on your significance, some aspects of integrity may be more important than others. For instance, if you are listing your property under criterion C because it is an excellent example of Italianate architecture, those brackets, that material, is incredibly important. If you are listing your property because it is associated with education, the siding, right, of the building is not near as important as the interior function of the building, right? So if you have a 1-room schoolhouse that's sided with aluminum siding, that's a lot less concerning to integrity than if the schoolhouse, the 1 room, has been subdivided into 10 rooms, or you have a large addition, right? So there's that conversation. And then there's a conversation about the length of your period of significance. If your period of significance is 100 years because it's associated with commerce, and you've had changes over time that are also associated with commerce, you have to think about that. And we'll get to that in just a second. Everybody got it? You ready? All right. So, acquired significance. This is what I was just talking about. So here we have 2 examples of acquired significance. So these are both downtown commercial buildings. On the left is the Nee Brothers and the Faribault Commercial Historic District. On the right is the Franta Building in the Montgomery Historic Commercial District. They are both considered contributing to their historic districts. You can see in the picture on the left of the Nee Brothers building that this was a typical, early 20th century commercial storefront that in the 1920s, 1925 specifically, had a complete redesign in order to turn this dry goods store into a jeweler's building. The period of significance for this district runs to 1966, which means that that storefront, as it is today, has acquired significance as it stands today. It also contributes and supports the significance of the property. The Franta building, you can see it also was a typical early 20th century commercial storefront. Sometime in the 1970s, it was also changed to meet the aesthetic that the commercial downtown of the building owner specifically was interested in. So we have a complete infill of the first floor storefront, as well as the addition of, there's a technical term for that, but I always think about it as the eyebrows. So the awning that is covered in the shingles, right? The Montgomery Historic Commercial District's period of significance runs till 1940, which means the changes that were implemented on that building do not support the significance of the property because they were done after the period of significance. They were not present during the period of significance and therefore are considered non-contributing. Good? Okay. This actually isn't the whole thing, and I'm so sorry because it gets really complicated. Okay, here's another thing to think about. The original fabric does not equal the historic fabric. in the context of this world, original and historic are not synonyms. They can be synonyms, but you have to assume that they're not until you have gone through the assessment process we talked about earlier. So for instance, this is the Moss and McAndrew building in Rochester. This is a photograph on the left of it in 1902. It was built as a camera factory. In 1909, the Moss and McAndrew plumbing business bought the building. They turned the first floor into commercial storefronts. The significance of this property is related to the Moss and McAndrew's plumbing business. They supplied all of the plumbing fixtures that allowed the Mayo brothers to move forward with antiseptic, the process of sterilizing equipment for surgeries. So like they not just like Home Depot plumbing supplied, like they designed these systems for the Mayo brothers and their early clinics. So that is their significance. So when we talk about rehabilitation, this is the original building. But if you were going to come in and try to say, we want a brick in the front, that's inappropriate because the significance is related to that 1909 change, right? So this is now just old. That is historic. So when we think about, we've now run through the process of doing the analysis, we know why it's significant, we know why when the property was significant. Now we're talking about character-defining features. So a character-defining feature are the features that convey this historic significance in the greatest way. Now, there is no way any narrative is ever going to be able to list every character-defining feature. And there are many, many features, pieces of material, functionality, form, open space that contribute to significance that are not considered character-defining features. But when we think about character-defining features, the way I think about them is like, these are non-starters. If this thing was missing, it wouldn't be the thing anymore, right? If you have a Victorian house that no longer has a porch, you don't have a Victorian house. You have a Foursquare with like cool shingles, right? That's different. So I want to encourage you to think about character-defining features are not always what we consider them. So this is the North Star Center in Minneapolis. This is a massive 3-use 1960s complex that was dropped down in the center of Minneapolis. It is clearly architecturally distinct. However, it is listed under Criterion A because of this wonky corridor. So this is the first building in Minneapolis to be designed to integrate itself into the Skyway system. So this is an entire block-size building that put commercial properties inside on the 3rd floor so that you can access them without going outside. So everything you see on the exterior does contribute to the building, right? Like if this had all been covered in shingles, we would not have listed the property. It very much contributes to the building. But one of the primary character-defining features is that corridor, which is not typically what you think of, which is why I put it up here, because it's cool. It's also weird, right? Like, who's going to list something for the Skyway system? I do. So, when you're thinking about your critical analysis, and this is what's so important, this is why you can't apply the criteria in the National Register the same way all the time to every building, because it's all about the why. It's very specific. I want you to start with your criterion area of significance. What are you important for? And then you move to your period of significance and integrity. And then you get to your character defining features. You move up. It's always that same process. And once you reach the top of these characters, once you understand why you're significant, when you're significant, and then what are those specific character defining features, the general character and the character defining features, then you can jump off of this block into Natascha's arms, and she will help you. Does anybody have any questions on that section? Okay, we'll get to generals after, but.
Please don't jump into my house.
I had thought that transition through well enough.
It's all good, it's all good. So I'm gonna go back to this slide quick though. And so when we're applying the standards, I'm thinking these things in my head too, but in the sense of kind of what's at the top of my mind, what are we most concerned about when we're applying the standards? Am I most concerned about the shingles that covered the North Star Center that you want to kind of pull off? Or am I concerned about that hallway? And I'm going to say that I got lost in that hallway several times and went in multiple circles, and someone had to come get me almost. So it doesn't look that complicated, but when you're in it, you're like, anyway. Of course, they've added a couple things, and then you like get into these little dead ends. So here we go. So we're talking about, people talk about law standards. They are the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And initially they're developed to help the federal government essentially regulate itself, in the sense that they're handing out, after the Historic Preservation Act, they're starting to hand out grants for historic buildings, and they're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, how do I say this is a good or bad thing you're doing to the historic building? We can't have tons of people out there just going, my gut reaction is I don't like it, or I do like it, or I don't really like Victorian houses that much, so I don't care. So here we have our first Secretary of the Interior ever, appointed in 1849, Mr. Thomas Ewing. And then here we have, during that same moment when we passed the Preservation Act, a lot of other countries were thinking about the same thing. We need to kind of address how we are going to actually decide to treat historic buildings and what is good and bad. And I'm using the air quotes over here. And so there was a large gathering in Venice, and they started in 1964, and they started to discuss that issue collectively. And then when we began to need to formalize more than just there's this international talk of thinking about it, Secretary Cecil de Anders, did I say that right? Anders, sorry. I don't have to say his name very often, mostly just during this presentation. So they went back and were like, well, we have the basis of what the international community is thinking about how we treat buildings, but we want to do it the way that's right for us here in the US. So we took those as kind of a basis, and then we applied them, and we said, no, but this is what we're concerned about. Because preservation in different countries means, and different cultures means pretty different things. So here in the US, we're fairly focused on material, whereas say in Japan, they're focused on craftsmanship. That's what they're preserving, is craftsmanship. And they work on the historic buildings, and then pretty much similar things happen, but it's because those highly skilled craftsmen are doing the work, then that's what they're preserving. So here we have our secretary, our current secretary. These are her standards, Secretary Halstead. So the next question is kind of like, well, who uses these standards? Is it just this bossy person in the government? So it's not just for the tax credit program. It's not just for everybody. But essentially, all the federal agencies are using them. So when the Department of Agriculture is trying to address historic buildings that they have, that's what they're using. The State Historic Preservation Offices, there's 53 of them, plus the TIPOs. They are also using them as their guide, because remember, we're doing this not because of taste, not because of what I prefer or don't prefer. This is a group agreement about how we're going to approach things. And then we have obviously the CLGs, and then really you can apply, whoever you are, you can apply the standards to your building. And it can be to buildings that aren't capital H historic. There's no reason, because they're just a good understanding of how to approach a building and maintain character while changing your use. So, and here we go. Ginny mentioned this, the standards, the SOI standards are built to be applied to anything on the National Register. That includes the Jolly Green Giant, it includes bridges, it includes traditional cultural properties, it includes shipwrecks, it includes bridges, it's all the stuff. So, which makes them, by definition, have to be flexible, right? So how else are you gonna apply these things to Jolly Green Giant and our buildings of all the styles in all the different kind of districts we have? We have industrial districts, brewing companies, we have residential districts. So the standards are being applied. We're represented up here in Minnesota, that's supposed to be and then this is the rest of the nation. So we need to look at that. Again, we're applying the standards in a very broad way. Now, the standards, as we'll see here, as I'm going to go through them and kind of help interpret them, they're not, and sorry for the old pictures of the guidelines. For some reason, the National Park Service had like even an older version up and I couldn't take a snap of it. But in any event, so we use the guidelines, and sometimes people conflate the guidelines and the standards. So the guidelines are all the things that are organized by all sorts of things like building exterior, masonry, wood, architectural metals, roofs, windows, and then we go through and use the standards and say, this is our recommended treatment, this is not recommended. And that bulk, so the standards fit on one sheet of paper, the guidelines are multiple books, and are, each of them this thick. So those are the bulk of kind of just talking through and using the standards, helping people think through. Because all the buildings and all the things are so different, it is hard to approach the standards and say, what do you really mean when you say avoid? I don't know. So here there's one for buildings, and there's one for landscapes, which is organized completely differently, spatially organized, land, patterns, topography, vegetation. But we also have the flood guidelines now, which are to be used for buildings that suddenly find themselves in a floodplain that didn't used to be a floodplain. And you really have to perhaps apply more aggressive use of the standards. And here we're going to help you try and be more aggressive in this specific need. You don't yet get to use the flood guidelines when you don't have flood problems, right? And then we have the sustainability guidelines, which are meant to kind of know how to start adding green roofs here or solar panels, because we can do that. So, but as you kind of saw in the guidelines, there are actually 4 sets of the standards. So the first one is preservation. It's a much more focused on just maintaining the building as it is. So sometimes that means that when you're kind of shutting the building down and you're mothballing it and holding it, you're just repairing it. They're more focused on materials. They're like, let's not make any big decisions or changes. Sometimes it's just kind of like the maintenance of your house. It's like painting and that sort of thing. But it's definitely, when you pick one of these standards, you're picking this set of standards because they do actually work at cross purposes. We all call ourselves preservationists, and this preservation top one is mostly just about kind of just maintaining it, keeping it the way it is. Rehabilitation standards, which is what we're legally required to use for the tax credit program, and most often what people mean when they say the standards, is the rehabilitation standards. And that's the kind of standard that you can use to take a warehouse into apartment buildings, and it's a set of standards we used at the Minnesota State Capitol because it's very high integrity, but at the same time, the legislature is trying to use this building to help the government of Minnesota move forward, and they kind of need computers and good HVAC to do that. So the restoration standards is the one that often people kind of get confused about as being the rehab standards. They want to do the restoration standards, but they find out, oh gosh darn, these things are really strict. This is what we're using for historic house museums and things like that, because this means that you can pick a really narrow period of significance and remove stuff, and you kind of have to put stuff back. And so it's like what the nieces of George Washington, and they built stuff and he got rid of it because it wasn't George Washington. So, and then the reconstruction standards is when we have no resource left and we are gonna put it back. We're gonna rebuild it. We don't use these too often because we got lots of other things to take care of. So reconstruction is a very, very precise thing and is not often used. We almost always use the rehab standards. So the rehab standards is essentially, like it says here, making possible compatible use for property through repairs, alterations, and additions. A lot of people sometimes think that rehab is for buildings that have no integrity, which is kind of like, no, we use it at the Capitol. We got plenty of integrity there. We use it all over the place. It's not necessarily, it can be used on buildings with less integrity or more integrity, but it's not about, we're not saying, forget all this, we're only using it for things that we kind of, like it's like the one that we can mess with things, but it still has a strong ethos of repair and retaining. So most of, there's 10 standards. It's mostly about historic character, historic material, and then what we do when we make modifications and a guide on how to make modifications so that we can maintain character and maintain material and then just help make new uses. So sometimes that could just be an elevator tower, or it could be a new porch where there used to be a porch, or it can be or a gigantic addition. So let's see. So here are the first 4 standards out of the 10. And you'll notice the first standard is property will be used as it was historically or be given a new use that requires minimal change. So sometimes when we're talking about, so the standards have always been built since the 70s to accommodate new use. This is how we get warehouses, concrete warehouses turning into apartment buildings because they are that flexible. So sometimes people are like, we can't touch the building. I'm like, you can lick it if you want, I don't care. But you can certainly make it into apartment buildings if that use that says minimal fits in. So then we have the historic character of the property will be retained and preserved. So this is kind of a catch-all. Historic character shall be retained. So if it's school, we want it to kind of still be a school. Each property we recognize as a physical record. And Ginny was kind of talking about some of this stuff too, over time and place. So that means not just original, but is historic, so that allows us some room within the period. Significant changes to the property have, oh wait, I kind of mix these up. They're the same. No conjectural features. This is the one where we're using, in my head, I use the standards so often that they're all like one thing in my head. So sometimes when I have to pull them apart for people, I get a little confused. And then I sound like I don't know what I'm doing. So when we're doing this, we're keeping kind historic character, character defining elements or architectural character, and integrity. So all the things that Ginny was talking about, I'm trying to look at here. So here's a picture that's showing the building. You can see it, I don't have a little pointer. On the little corner here is a bank. This used to be the building. And then the bank got fancy in the 1960s, lopped off a thing like that was just like this on the side and built a super cool, well-designed addition that's way bigger than the original building. So, and that's all within the period of significance, and it is kind of what it is. And we are going to kind of look at it as a whole. So, I think when you're looking at character, you're thinking about the whole building, setting, association, and all of the things. We're coming up with really big ideas about it. Is it industrial character? Is it, because all of these things are about your building. People sometimes get frustrated with the standards. You let me do it on this building, why can't I do it on this building? Or so yeah, it's hard because it's not all the same all the time, but at the same time, you do not want to get stuck with using the same set of standards that was designed for this very ornate, highly finished theater on a finished log cabin, right? So preserve the plaster. I don't have plaster, or I don't have any. My craftsmanship is this incredible sculpture of a building, not ornate plaster and painting. So I'm going to pick and understand while I'm doing this, what is the important craftsmanship, what is the important item about this that makes it what it is. So then we're going to make decisions based on that. Now here's kind of a setting and site sort of thing. The buildings here that are considered, actually the whole complex back there, this is the Pillsbury Amil complex on the right, and then this is the GM headquarters on the left. And so the buildings, here we see the Brand House, I think it's the Brand House, on the corner, kind of facing us in the front. It's 2 stories, it's got lots of windows. This here, the GM building has got 3 stories and lots of windows, but they're radically different settings. One is an industrial setting with carts laying around and dirt and grunginess and lots of activity, and here we have a placid pool and the gardens, very orderly. So even though the buildings are about the same size and massing, not completely, but in this picture it looks that way. We're going to have a totally different attitude about what character we're going after, what decisions we're making. So leaving cool sledges around with horses is not what we're going to do here on the left. So what are the more specific features about the building and the craftsmanship and all of the other things? Here we have a super vertical building with lots of windows. They're both masonry, check it out, but their massing, their profiles, their styles are totally different things. And this is when we're just looking for all of just the pattern and the shape of the building itself. And it's going to tell us a lot about what it is. Here we have an office tower and a house. Not a usual house, but and then we're going to look really close at it, and we're going to say, what is it? We can say it's masonry, but hey, you got different kinds, right? So, and we got highly finished, we got patterns, we've got brittle things, we've got granite things, we've got things that we've conglomerated together, and its character is complete crazy conglomeration mess. And we've got ones that are like super, super tight lines, exactly the way we want it. Now, so we kind of talked about the exterior of the building, but it's really a lot about the interior of the building, depending on what building you have. So, and so we're going to place a hierarchy of level of importance. So in a city council building, the approach to the building, the front facade is super important because this is where the citizens come. But then, and then the path, just like that skyway, the path to the city council chambers is what's going to be really important, and the council chambers. Are the offices on the side a little bit less important? Maybe if Lincoln was there, or George Washington.
Lincoln was never there.
Wasn't there. He almost is never there. He's never there. Did I just do that? Okay. So, and then I always joke, the basements we're not too worried about, unless it turns out you got a secret society underneath there. And then somebody will almost inevitably say, yeah, we did have secret meetings down there. It was great. Like, you may have not wanted to tell me that, but that's okay. So here we have completely different interior spaces. On the left, something very not exciting, but is in fact the historic space. And then we have this highly finished, awesome thing. And then we have this pared down industrial. It's not just industrial, it's pared down. There's nothing there but the structure. That's what it is. So looking at kind of standard 1, kind of going back to that a little bit, it's about changing use. Am I missing a slide or something? Cool. So there should be a slide in here about picking how do we go about it says continue the use or one that's for minimal change. So would I pick this building here on the left to be an industrial factory for, I don't know, grain storage, or would I pick it to be housing or offices? So if I bought this building, I'd probably be like, I think I'm gonna have, I need to have lots of windows if I'm gonna need housing or offices. I need rooms and, kind of floor plate. So I think I'm gonna put my housing project in this building on the left rather than in a grain elevator. It's just kind of works with it. So that's where we'll start out. This here is about change and how do we decide what can and can't change. So here we see on the left, it doesn't have, it just has 2 stairs up to it, and then somebody's like, oh, but for my housing, I want big porches on top. I just love big porches, and you're like, it doesn't have porches, I'm sorry. But you can do your historic research, and sure enough, this thing had a huge porch on the front. So suddenly we can make a big change without, and totally meet the standards. Now, if that building never had porches, we did our historic research, then maybe, not so much. We'd have to figure out how to maybe put the porches on the back or something like that. Because that's our hierarchy. So Ginny had both these same slides. So, because these are our star examples of really totally awesome acquired significance. And I'm sure there's more, so we need to go out and take some pictures of more. Because, when I became the historical, before I became a historical architect of SHPO, and I was just helping out initially, there was conversation about the cadets here on the right. Shouldn't they be able to take off that 1930s edition and go back to the 1880s storefront? And no, it's a very specific design. They were very intentful about doing that. It's within the historic period. It's not like somebody went down to the corner and said, find the door in the trash and kind of stick it on there and we'll have a new entrance, it'll be good. No, they decided to do this. They designed this. It was in step with what storefront design was evolving into in that period when it was significant. And so, it was more big sheets of glass and this very deco little thing on the top, the transom. So that gained significance because it was intentful, and so you have to make the design. Just because it does done in the historic period doesn't automatically mean it's historic. You have to just measure whether or not. So during a project and somebody wants to remove that and make it go back to the 1880s, no, sorry, this is acquired significance, and you'll really like it. And they did really like it in the end of the project. They were like, wow, I'm so glad we kept this. So, however, some changes don't acquire significance. And this is a super extreme example, but this is an evolved building. Yes, it is true, it's the same building. And you can barely recognize it, and this work was not done during a historic period. However, if, say, whatever was done here on the right is actually a sign of how people were approaching industry and commercial spaces during the period of significance, then maybe this is historic. It's a pretty bold statement. They were very specific about it. So some of the characters, some of the things that's happening often when we're making changes and rehabilitating buildings, we're talking about adding new systems. So that's part of the changes. It could be in your historic rehab, all you're doing is adding air conditioning. But ducts and things take up lots of big space, and people try and find ways to put them in here. So this on the right is a highly finished, is a finished apartment building, and they decided the best solution was to stick all the ducts in the corridor. But that's not the character of the corridor. The character here, we have a school on the left. It's all about the corridors. So this is what the public part of the building is. So we try and keep them out. We'll try and keep the ducts on the unit side. That's the decisions that we're making, because we're looking at that character of the building. Ooh, that came out blurry. I don't know if you guys see that. So this is, I hope it's clearer in the back. So here on the left, there's big trusses, and the ducts are kind of inside of that giant truss. And so they're kind of working with what they have. It's an industrial space, so we can expose this stuff as opposed to the finished space. But here on the industrial space, this is a warehouse. It was a warehouse, it was not a brewery. So, and they put in a whole lot of systems, and you can't even hardly see the column capitals anymore. So here even though it's an industrial character, we've kind of gone past it, and it now looks kind of like a boiler room rather than an industrial space that was a warehouse. Maybe if it was a brewery, maybe, because pipes are everywhere in breweries, but this is really unorganized and not super cool. So like I said, we kind of worked on the historic character, and then we have historic material, and all these things are interrelated. And I should stop and say something like, we've been having discussions with the SHPOs and the Park Service right now, so how are we handling acoustical tile ceilings? Because the drop ceilings is what this stuff is. We started using it in the 60s, and we're now getting very used to the idea this is a historic material. You know, like 10 years ago, it was like, oh my God, the acoustical tile ceiling is historic now. What are we gonna do? And I thought, oh, all of our problems will be solved when we start having historic acoustical tile ceilings, because everybody wants them all the time, and they can't have them because they have historic plaster ceilings. But of course, now that we have acoustical tile ceilings, everyone's like, we don't like acoustical tile ceilings. We'd like some plaster ceilings, some chipboard ceilings. So that's always part of pick the right building, be where you want to be. So it's, and the truth is that the way I approach it is that because there was discussions and everyone was like, oh, well, but this historic acoustical tile ceiling shows the major change and how we were handling systems. It's evidence of the new materials that were available. It's evidence of how the construction industry was shifting its entire focus about how you built buildings. And in my head, the easy decision to make is, it was here during the historic period, and this is what they chose. And so without having to know all of the things about maybe why this acoustical tile ceiling is important, we can take a shortcut and say, well, it's the historic material that they chose, so there's reasons for it. So it's kind of built into the decisions that people made when they were building the building, just immediately reflect what's important to them and what's going on for them. So, and so it's gonna immediately, the materials reflect what's important to the people who are building it. And it's not, well, if people in 1820 knew about acoustical drop teal size ceilings, they would have totally used it. No, they didn't have it. It's not important to them. It doesn't reflect their time period. But to a 1960s person, it was the most awesome thing ever. So, because you were hip and cool when you used it. So, and here we have the 8 standards that generally address material, and really, in a lot of ways, is talking about craftsmanship that we talked about, integrity. It's talking about, but it's also talking about deteriorated historic features will be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old design. And sometimes, but then we have number 8 and number 7 clearly is very specific. It's about when people were sandblasting buildings and using horrible chemicals on their buildings, and they felt like, we really need to say this. And right now, it's kind of almost assumed. So the standards are a little bit of a reflection of their time too. And then 8 is archaeology, which is really, really important, and people often forget that they're in the standards, but there they are, they're truly, because this is again a sign that we're addressing all of the, items in the National Register. So we're gonna go to that. So, and historic buildings generally we kind of have to shift our attitude about how we approach them because they are built to be repaired. In construction industry now, things are built for replacement. So you take a whole window out and you replace the whole window. That's just how it's done. The manufacturer makes the window. Even though it's true during the historic-y times, they did have people who made the windows off-site and they brought them depending on what was going on. Sometimes you could just buy them and stick them in. But all of these things are built of parts. Now, can we say that so much anymore with 1960s and 70s buildings and even some 80s buildings on the register now? Those buildings weren't necessarily built to be repaired. They were built for major replacements. Your insulated glass unit gaskets they kind of lose their oomph after 15, 20, maybe we can make them go 40 years. But they're gonna get foggy, the things that you just can't repair them. So we have to actually be thinking about what is this historic material and what was the attitude of how we were approaching it as we were doing it, because those 1970s buildings, I can confidently say to you, that wood window was built to be repaired. It has parts and pieces that you can go in there and deal with. It's made out of old growth wood. And yeah, if you have a well-maintained historic wood window with a screen, we can make that perform energy performance-wise. Can we say that for sure about an aluminum window from the 1960s? I have encountered 1970s historic windows that were aluminum and were excellent, and we regasketed them, and it was great. But then the sliding doors right next to it were pieces of not very good workmanship and barely worked and couldn't carry the wind load. They miscalculated. It was a sad thing. So all of the windows got repaired because they could be repaired, and the doors, there was nothing left of them, and there was nothing we could do to repair or improve them. So you kind of have to be thinking both. Well, it used to be that I could get up here and say, everything can be repaired, stop replacing things. Now it's kind of like, okay, we're gonna have to stop and think about each thing. Now, we did talk about that number 7. It was real specific. I did not make this picture up. This is true. Somebody repointed half the building in a different color. So this is why we get super picky about color and joint profile. Otherwise, your building looks like a little zebra. So you have to be careful. But again, I want to point out here that on the right-hand side, these people are doing what they think is really beautiful. And we have to decide to what period of significance are we working to. And this was their best effort, and maybe it's historic, maybe it isn't. But we can see here on the left the beautiful prison glass but this is, that's a 1930s kind of storefront, 20s, and then this one is later. So we just have to kind of decide, this is when it's really good to be really picky, so like what the repointing, because it's not just about us being picky about repointing materials, it's about taking care of your building well, the way it is, and also having unexpected results, because I'm pretty sure the owners who repointed this did not think, I want a two-tone building. So so it's just about when to be picky and when not to be picky too. Now, here is a town that has everyone, obviously it kind of popped up at a certain period, and everybody was using this round top alienate thing. Some of them have hoods, some of them don't, with the roundy arch on top. I'm getting really technical here, guys. And we can see, I'm going to give you a clue that the one on the top left is a historic window. So which ones of these are appropriate? We can see better tries and not as good tries. My favorite one is the one kind of their second from the right on the top. Totally different choice. So this is why it's important to kind of go back to what the original, or excuse me, the historic thinking was on the window openings and that sort of thing. So this is, if we're not, and this is because these windows did, I don't know if all these windows were actually beyond replaced or repair when they chose to replace them. But I'll also say here, we're looking at a lot of aluminum windows and metal windows. It's often easiest just replace the material with what it was historically, because it's real easy to make a wood window look like a wood window, and it's harder to make an aluminum window look like an aluminum window, or a wood window. But I will say that I'm a proponent of a metal-clad wood window on a building like this, because in Minnesota we don't have the wood we used to, and the climate will just eat that window up. So it's a good example, because the Park Service specifically on small buildings says you should have wood windows replace wood windows. They, in their guidelines, say you shouldn't have a clad window for a small building like this. But they understand that Minnesota is a little tougher than other places, so we regularly have replacement material that's clad. And here's another thing, so between material and character, the one on the right is not an industrial space, like the Savvy Cool one here on the left. It's just really poorly maintained. This is gonna be more of a finished space. It's supposed to be plaster, but it's kind of all in piles and looks really rough. It is not an industrial character, it's just in really bad condition. And here we have the ones, the standards, and we'll see here number 3 is repeated, about making additions. And this can kind of apply to major changes within inside the building too, but new additions, you can see on the picture on the right, that's an addition on the back. So it's different, but it's the same. Somebody brought in the cousin brother of the building and attached it. And this is a very subtle, following the kind of very conservative rules. New additions should not destroy the historic building to make it happen, and they should be compatible and differentiated. You don't pick one of the two words, you use both of them. And also you should not, this is saying don't, number 3 is saying don't make a addition that people plan to make but then didn't, and now you're gonna enact that later. But one of the new additions here is that a totally new thing for our buildings to think about is ADA and unrestricted or barrier-free access. There's right ways and wrong ways, or good ways and less good ways to do it, but it is ultimately the law, and it is the way to keep a building active and useful. We can't be a useful building to the community if we don't have it accessible. So there are some things that may not look quite right, but we're going to do it anyway because it's really important to include everyone in the building. Otherwise, the building will not be relevant to anyone anymore. So maybe we wouldn't put a rickety metal thing kind of straddling a stone thing. Maybe we want to try and make it out of stone. Same time as we understand that building owners don't always have all the cash to make a fine stone thing. So we're going to have to try and figure out how to just come up with the best solution. We just want the best solution. Here is a question of reversibility. This is a picture of some non-historic additions that they pulled off, and it was pretty rough on the historic building when it happened. So this treatment was not reversible. But I also will say, I remember Bonnie referred to yesterday, well, the solar panels are reversible so we can put them on there. I would say that the solar panels aren't okay not because the solar panels are okay, but not because they're reversible, but just because we're accepting new changes to the building. So I have all sorts of ideas and rules about how I think one would go about putting solar panels on, and we can talk about that. My first rule is that they should be on the side where you can actually collect solar energy, but there you go. Careful about what we're doing, so maybe we can have a rooftop addition there. Maybe it's a little bit less visible and not roundy. And here we have some new challenges. With climate change, everyone kind of is like, oh darn, we're not on the coast, we're not on the ocean coast, so we won't have to worry about any of the changes coming at us. Well, here we do have a lot of shoreline, a lot of water, and sometimes the water's gonna come at us all at the same time. And so here's a picture of using the flood standards and adaptation where this, there's a picture of it. Here's the picture on the left of it taller, and it's underwater there, and you can see the bridge getting kind of pushed away. The DNR came back and made some really good subtle choices about how to get this ready for the next flood. So there's room for thinking ahead on stuff like this. How are we gonna make that storefront not flood when we have a big rain event? So part of this always is how do we keep our ideas about the criterion and the integrity separate, or not separate, but how do we navigate how we do all of this is what I'm trying to say. And one of the first things is to have a great team. And people who've had some experience before. We always want new people, we're always trying to learn more, but it's good to have someone on your team to help you put together, because those folks on the left really were happy to have a couple guys that knew how to build a barn, and the rest of them could help out and learn. And I'm just fascinated by this picture on the right of people kind of walking this house on the street, because that's what they're doing. And also, a lot of people don't think design, architectural design, or design in general, they're like, oh, I don't want to do preservation because it's just not that creative, you don't have that much room for your thing. It's actually you have to be really creative in preservation, because here you have to react to something, here you have a set of rules, and I think it'll enhance your design. I think some really cool things, say the additions that are kind of, people feel like historic additions that are allowed by the standards are always kind of boring and ugly. They certainly don't have to be. If you're creative and interesting, design is you can work within those and be really creative and fascinating too. And I think that's it. There you go. There's some resources. Go online. It's awesome. Actually, the Park Service has a totally awesome set of briefs and standards. Are we at time, or are we having some questions?
About 7 minutes for questions. Well done.
Questions? Okay. I want some water.
Yeah, we'll switch.
So, yeah.
Buddy, yes?
A little bit for both of you.
Okay.
Going back to your Montgomery example with the awning that was attached in the 70s, are you seeing, or is there a way that at some point in time, that's going to have its own significance? So are you finding that we're doing more National Register nomination modifications or addendums, or are they being rewritten so that, extreme example, to want to include something like that? Are we starting to see some of that?
So the question was, forgive me if I get this wrong, but what I'm hearing is, as we move into the 1970s and things that are of the 1970s become historic, are we seeing nominations, additional documentation to nominations to accommodate that period of significance, so that these things can be historic, or are we seeing individual listings? And the answer is both. So one of the things that we need to be careful of is that we don't write a nomination to accommodate what we like in town. We do the historic research, which tells us when a property is significant. Now, up until about 5 or 10 years ago, everyone assumed that a commercial district's period of significance ended in 1929. We had the Great Depression, and there was no work for a few years, and so we sort of automatically ended our period of significance then. Because in the 70s or the 80s and 90s, we didn't particularly care about the changes that were made in the 1970s. We have expanded our thinking since then, and we are willing to consider a district's nomination specifically up through that later period, if the historic research can support it. If not only did understanding there's a lull in the Great Depression, what happened after that? Was there a concerted effort to bring businesses back, to revitalize? How much change happened? Up until the time when this was not the commercial center. And some of our smaller towns in Minnesota, their downtown is still the commercial center. They don't get the strip malls. It's not that kind of development. So we're seeing both additional documentation and new nominations to accommodate that time period. Faribault, for instance, just had a recent expansion that expanded the period of significance and the boundaries to accommodate a post-World War II continued significance. Montgomery was a new nomination, and that actually went up to 1940, which is a little bit different than 1930, and there were reasons why that was. So we're seeing it. I mean, one of the things that Natascha talked about with the standards, and one of the things that we talk about with the criterion, it's not about my opinion, or the National Park Service's opinion, or yours. The idea of these things is to remove the opinion from the equation. We apply the criteria and the standards, whether I like it or not. I have lots of opinions, none of which y'all get to know, unless I take off my badge and we talk about it outside, right? It's just, did I answer your question? All the things, all the time. Bring it to me and I'm happy to read it. Yes.
So my district is currently, actually, I believe our stuff is at your office. I live in Frontenac. And so Frontenac's getting,
sorry.
it's cool, it's whatever. You do you. Okay.
Well,
But we have, a rather significant sized district with properties that are in different states of existence, right? And we also are by a forest. For you guys that don't know, we have state forest on 3 sides and the Mississippi River on the 4th side of the neighborhood. And a lot of our properties have wood. And woodpeckers are really friendly, right? So what is becoming kind of the feeling about all the composite materials that can be made to look like what our style is, including we're starting to get more homeowners talking to us about the shingles that are now, that can look like shaker shingles or whatever. I know that's not the original, but what's kind of the feel with some of that? Like I have a cedar house and I don't want to replace that every year, I get the aluminum thing and kind of the vinyl, but there's also that reality component and that environmental component too.
Yeah, well, I think number one, woodpeckers are our friends. They tell us when there's bugs in our houses,
Sure do.
and we should do something about it. So they're just a friendly reminder that maybe you might have an infestation of carpenter ants that you didn't know about. So, and they are songbirds and they're protected, so don't do nothing naughty. I think substitute materials are generally allowed, and I should note that the Park Service is coming out with a new preservation brief in not very long about substitute materials and how to kind of navigate them. But wood siding would be the same as any other substitute material that we're looking at, and we're going to say, is the material beyond repair? Is it can you find this material to replace it? Is it readily available? Some places have suffered more than others. Is the one side of the house particularly suffering or not suffering? But if we get to the point where we're saying, yes, it's okay to replace this historic material, and we're going to go ahead and pick a substitute material. We're going to pick the substitute material that is most similar to the historic material, right? So that means, there's a lot of vinyl siding out there that has this wood grain on it that's really hard raised. Historic wood siding does not look like that, unless it's incredibly distressed. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to go with the historic character, so we want something that's smooth. Then a lot of times these sidings come in one size. So if you're in Frontenac, you're probably like this depth. Do they make a hardy board or other board that comes in that lap size? And a lot of people might think it's not that big of a deal if we go from this to this.
2.5 to 4.
Not to 4. That the inches. What's the big deal? But literally, I've seen houses look like they shrink or become doll houses because the scale is just suddenly completely off. And some of those siding types require that you have a corner board where there wasn't historically a corner board. Some have ones that have these like crazy little things where you hook it into, and then all of a sudden the house is covered with all these little weird lines that it didn't used to be. The products are getting better. There are some products you can really do what you want to do and have it look right. So it's not just about yes or no on something like that, because you also have to pick. So a lot of times will be for a roof, someone will say like, I have this crazy historic green shingle hexagon roof. And you're like, oh, that's going to be easy to find. So we're going to say, well, what's the most important of the character things? That it's green, that it's shingles, that it's hexagons. Is the scale of the historic hexagon, how important is that? Is it, because they do make green hexagon asphalt shingles still, but sometimes they make them really big or really little or with super slopies. And this one, the roof had, big hexagon shingles. So do we put the small hexagons on? Or do we say, no, it's just really important that it's green and we don't want to change the scale of the roof by putting on the tiny hexagon instead of the big hexagon? And that's really about that building and making a decision about that building, because the answer isn't always green or hexagon. It's about the goal of trying to capture the character of the building, not a dimension. It's not a yes or no. And there's always new products coming out that suddenly, even things that are like, it used to only be available in Canada, and now I can't get it in the US. Because I have been part of projects where literally there was a handoff of shingles on the border. It's all about, once you've gotten to that place where you're going to use a substitute material, then you start looking at what is the important feature and what does it actually look like, not what I'm assuming it looks like. So you actually really look at it.
Were you going to say something?
I was just gonna gently tap you to let you know that we're at time.
Okay.
I was not reaching for the microphone. But would you like,
No,
now that I have it.
I was just going to tell you about that.
We're available. We did not put our contact information on the screen because we forgot.
It's just I forgot to add you.
Oh, well then just call Natascha for all of your questions. I'm gonna get to Frontenac, I promise. It's on my desk. I love that answer.
We're old, it's fine.
Have a copy of your presentation that we.
I think we
We can make those available. That is not a problem.
Yep.
Preservation
one?
Why don't you email?
No, it's
Well, you can email me, or you can email John
Urban Man.
Fisher,
Yeah,
or Michelle.
Foundation.
whose hair is her-
Oh, I took that one. Yeah. Just
This is
401 or something. Yeah.
Received for a number of years now.
And she was like,
The
"Oh,
best
this
presentation I've heard.
conference and like."
No, we did. I'm just gonna follow. Yeah. Take a picture of it.
Stuff does get really technical. If you have a specific question, we can give you lots of guidance. We cannot answer that question for you in the hallway because that's not, we technically have to read something before we can give you an answer. But we're here for technical assistance anytime you need it. This stuff is complicated and we love it in a way that you do not. So be very careful which one of us ends up cornering whom.
Okay. I'll put out a stack of cards, and then I'll just tell you to talk to Ginny. But I do want to say it is technical and complicated, but I think always keeping in mind the goal. So not necessarily what they did last time or the other building, or that's not gonna work on my building. Think about the goal. The goal is to preserve historic material and when you can repair it, and when you do substitutes, you're trying to capture that character. And the goal is to retain the history. So, and just thinking about what makes my building what it is, and then I'm gonna start thinking about it that way. So you can end up in a pretty similar place just by sticking to the goal. And we got lots of rules and things about, because it really is important for us to not go to taste or opinions, because you know what, mid-century modern doesn't float my boat. She loves it. And I don't make decisions about what's correct on a mid-century modern building based on whether I like it or not. I make it based on its character and its significance. So, and on that note, go conference.